December 22, 1983. 14 trucks arrived at a New Mexico landfill carrying millions of brand new video games. Workers dumped them into a pit and sealed everything with concrete, as if burying nuclear waste. This was Atari, the company that had invented home gaming and printed money for 5 years straight. 18 months earlier, $2 billion in revenue, 80% market share, 10,000 employees, Wall Street calling it the future of entertainment. Now, bankruptcy, mass layoffs, retail stores refusing shipments. What makes this collapse truly shocking isn't that they failed, it's how they failed. Atari didn't lose to better technology or stronger competitors. They dominated the market right until the end. They lost to themselves. One catastrophic decision after another, each one seeming rational at the time, each one bringing them closer to that landfill. The warning signs were everywhere. Management saw them, documented them in memos, then ignored every single one. This is the story of how success creates its own blindness, and how an empire can evaporate in 18 months. Nolan Bushnell grew up in Clearfield, Utah, in a household where electrical engineering wasn't an abstract career path, but a practical necessity. His father worked as a cement contractor, and young Bushnell spent summers helping wire electrical systems for buildings under construction, learning to think about circuits and power flow the way other kids thought about baseball statistics. He wasn't particularly interested in traditional academics, but he displayed an unusual ability to understand how complex systems worked by breaking them down into their component parts and reassembling them in his mind. At the University of Utah, he studied electrical engineering while working in the campus arcade, which is where he first encountered Space War, a computer game developed at MIT that ran on a DE-CPDP-1 mainframe costing over $100,000. Most students saw it as an amusing curiosity. Bushnell saw it as a business opportunity, wrapped in a technological challenge. The insight that would eventually create the video game industry came from a simple calculation. If you could build a coin-operated version of a computer game that cost $50 to manufacture and generated $25 per week in quarters, you'd recover your investment in 2 weeks and generate pure profit afterward. The problem was that in 1970, building a computer capable of running even a simple game cost more than most people earned in a decade. Bushnell's breakthrough wasn't inventing a new kind of game. It was recognizing that you didn't need a general-purpose computer to create interactive entertainment. You could build single-purpose circuits dedicated to one specific game, eliminating 95% of the hardware complexity and 99% of the cost. He called the first prototype Computer Space, designed it to run on television sets using custom-built circuitry, and convinced a small manufacturing company called Nutting Associates to produce it. The game arrived in bars and bowling alleys in 1971, housed in a futuristic fiberglass cabinet that looked like it had been designed for a Stanley Kubrick film. Computer Space failed commercially, but not because the concept was wrong. It failed because Bushnell had made a critical miscalculation about his audience. The game required players to understand thrust, rotation, and inertia in a zero-gravity environment. Concepts that engineering students at Utah found intuitive, but that confused the average bar patron who just wanted something simple to play while drinking beer. What Bushnell learned from that failure would shape everything that followed. The best arcade games weren't the most sophisticated or technically impressive. They were the ones that any person could understand within 10 seconds and spend hours trying to master. Complexity killed quarters. Accessibility generated them. That lesson, learned through financial loss and humiliation, became the philosophical foundation of Atari. In 1972, Bushnell founded Atari in a small office space in Sunnyvale with $500 and a partner named Ted Dabney. The name came from the Japanese strategy game Go, where Atari is a term meaning a stone or group of stones is in imminent danger of being captured. a warning that you're about to lose unless you respond immediately. Bushnell liked the sound of it and the vaguely exotic connotation it carried. He liked even more that it suggested challenge and competition without explicitly using words that might alienate non-gamers. The company's first product was Pong, a game so simple that its instructions consisted of 3 words. Avoid missing ball for high score. A ball bounced back and forth across the screen. 2 players controlled paddles that could hit it. That was the entire game. Bushnell hired Al Alcorn, a young engineer who had worked on video amplifier systems, and gave him the assignment to build it as a training exercise, not expecting it to become a commercial product. Alcorn spent 3 months building the prototype, installing it in a local bar called Andy Capp's Tavern in Sunnyvale as a test. Within 2 weeks, the bar owner called to report the machine had broken down. When Alcorn arrived to diagnose the problem, he discovered the coin mechanism had jammed because it was overflowing with quarters. Players were lining up to feed coins into a wooden box running a game that consisted of 2 rectangles hitting a square back and forth. The simplicity that had doomed computer space became Pong's greatest asset. Anyone could play it. Everyone wanted to. Bushnell immediately pivoted the entire company toward manufacturing Pong machines, and by the end of 1973, Atari had sold over 8,000 units at $1,200 each, generating nearly $10 million in revenue from a company that had started with $500 18 months earlier. Think about that trajectory for a second. From a rented office and a single prototype to a multi-million-dollar manufacturing operation in less than 2 years, all built on a game that took 3 months to design. The success attracted imitators immediately. By 1974, over 20 companies were producing Pong clones, flooding the market with identical games in cheaper cabinets. Bushnell realized that Atari's advantage wouldn't come from protecting Pong. The technology was too simple to defend with patents, and the competition was too aggressive to suppress legally. Instead, Atari's survival depended on speed, releasing new games before competitors could reverse engineer the previous ones, building brand recognition that made Atari synonymous with quality arcade entertainment, and establishing relationships with distributors that would favor Atari products over generic imitations. They released Tank in 1974, Grand Track 10 in the same year, and began developing a portfolio of games that shared technology but offered different experiences. The strategy worked not because the games were dramatically better, but because Atari was first to market and had the manufacturing capacity to flood arcades before competitors could catch up. By 1975, Atari had become the dominant force in coin-operated entertainment, controlling roughly 30% of the arcade game market and generating $39 million in revenue. Bushnell had proven that interactive entertainment could be a legitimate business, not a novelty. But he also recognized a fundamental limitation. Arcade games required physical locations, coin mechanisms, and constant maintenance. Players had to leave their homes, spend money per session, and compete for machine access. The real revolution wouldn't come from improving arcade games. It would come from bringing them home. Bushnell began sketching designs for a home version of Pong, a device that would connect to a television set and allow people to play video games in their living rooms without quarters, without leaving the house, without waiting in line. The technology existed. Television sets were already computers of a sort, and the circuitry required to generate Pong's simple graphics could be miniaturized and mass-produced. What Atari needed was capital to manufacture units at scale and marketing resources to reach consumers who had never heard of video games. Bushnell needed a partner with deep pockets and retail distribution networks. In 1976, he found one. Warner Communications acquired Atari in October 1976 for $28 million, a price that seemed astronomical for a company that manufactured coin-operated games and employed fewer than 500 people. But Warner's executives weren't buying an arcade game company. They were buying what they believed would become the future of home entertainment. The timing was deliberate. Warner had watched the home video game market emerge through products like the Magnavox Odyssey, a primitive system that had sold over 300,000 units despite minimal functionality and poor marketing. If a mediocre product could generate that level of consumer interest, a properly funded and marketed system from the company that dominated arcades could potentially reach millions of households. Warner's analysis suggested the home console market could reach $500 million in annual revenue within 5 years. They were wrong. It would reach $2 billion within 6 years, and Atari would control almost all of it. The first challenge was engineering a home console that could match arcade quality while costing less than $200, a price point Warner's market research indicated was the maximum most families would pay for a game system. Atari's engineers, led by Jay Miner and Steve Mayer, designed what would become the Atari 2600, a system built around a custom microprocessor that could generate color graphics and sound through a standard television set. The innovation wasn't in any single component, but in how the pieces worked together. The system used the television circuitry to do most of the heavy lifting for display, while the console itself handled only the game logic and graphics generation. This architectural decision reduced manufacturing costs dramatically while delivering visual quality that exceeded anything available in the home market. The cartridge system, which allowed users to swap games by plugging in different modules, was borrowed from earlier systems but refined to be more reliable and cheaper to manufacture. Each cartridge contained a small circuit board with read-only memory chips storing the game code, which meant Atari could manufacture games for roughly $10 per unit and sell them for $25 to $40, generating profit margins that exceeded 70% on software alone. Warner invested over $100 million in manufacturing facilities, component inventory, and marketing for the 2600's launch in September 1977. The initial retail price was $199, which included the console, 2 joystick controllers, and a pack-in game called Combat. The marketing campaign positioned the 2600 not as a toy, but as a home entertainment system comparable to a television or stereo, something the entire family would use, not just children. Warner's retail distribution networks, built through decades of selling records and films, gave Atari access to department stores, electronics retailers, and catalog sales that smaller competitors couldn't match. By the end of 1977, Atari had sold over 400,000 units, generating $80 million in revenue and validating Warner's investment thesis. But those numbers, impressive as they were, represented only the beginning. The 2600 had been released too late in the year to capture the full Christmas shopping season, and most retailers had underestimated demand, leaving stores sold out by mid-December. The real explosion would come in 1978. The genius of the cartridge system became apparent within 6 months of launch. Every console Atari sold created a customer who would buy multiple games over the system's lifetime, generating recurring revenue that exceeded the initial hardware purchase. An average 2600 owner bought 5 to 7 games over the console's life cycle, spending $200 to $300 on software alone. Atari's manufacturing costs for cartridges were approximately $10, which meant each game sold generated $15 to $30 in pure profit. The economics were so favorable that Atari could sell the console itself at break-even, or even a slight loss, and still generate enormous profits through software sales. This became the business model that would define the video game industry for the next 40 years. Hardware as a platform, software as profit engine. Warner's analysts projected that by 1982, the 2600 would be in 10 million homes. each generating an average of $50 in annual game purchases, creating a $500 million software business built on top of hardware sales. The projections proved conservative. By 1979, the 2600 had sold over 4 million units, and Atari's revenue reached $400 million. The company employed over 3,000 people across manufacturing, engineering, and sales. The Sunnyvale headquarters expanded to accommodate the growth, with new buildings constructed specifically to house the expanding engineering teams developing games for the 2600 platform. The manufacturing facility in El Paso, Texas, ran 3 shifts per day, churning out cartridges at a rate that exceeded 50,000 units daily during peak production. Retail stores created dedicated electronic sections to display the growing library of Atari games, which had expanded from the original 9 launch titles to over 40 available cartridges. Third-party publishers began approaching Atari about creating games for the 2600, but the company refused all licensing proposals, maintaining absolute control over what software appeared on their platform. This decision seemed strategically sound. It ensured quality control, prevented market saturation, and allowed Atari to capture 100% of software revenue. In retrospect, it was the first decision that would eventually contribute to the company's collapse, though no one recognized it at the time. The culture inside Atari during this period combined Silicon Valley engineering innovation with the entertainment industry's creative chaos. Programmers worked in small teams, often just 1 or 2 people per game, with minimal management oversight. The company offered profit-sharing bonuses based on game sales, which meant successful designers could earn more than executives. This created an environment of intense competition and creativity, but also one where individual programmers began to see themselves as artists whose contributions were undervalued by corporate management. When Warren Robinett programmed Adventure, one of the 2600's most successful titles, he included a hidden secret, the first Easter egg in video game history, that displayed his name when players performed a specific sequence of actions. Management was furious when they discovered it, not because of the content, but because it represented individual credit in a system designed to promote the corporate brand. Robinett and several other top designers left Atari in 1979 to found Activision, the first third-party game publisher for home consoles, creating games for the 2600 without Atari's permission or approval. Atari's response to Activision's formation revealed the company's fundamental misunderstanding of the market it had created. Instead of working with the departing designers or creating a licensing system that would allow third-party development while maintaining quality standards, Atari filed lawsuits attempting to prevent Activision from releasing 2600 games, arguing that only Atari had the legal right to create software for its platform. The courts disagreed, ruling that once Atari sold a console to a consumer, they couldn't restrict what software that consumer used on it. This legal defeat opened the floodgates. Within 2 years, over 30 companies were producing games for the 2600, none of which paid licensing fees to Atari, none of which met any quality standards, and all of which competed directly with Atari's own titles on retail shelves. But in 1980, this future disaster remained invisible. Atari was generating over $600 million in revenue, controlled 75% of the home console market, and was projected to reach $1 billion by 1982. Warner's stock price had doubled since acquiring Atari. Wall Street analysts were calling it the most successful acquisition in entertainment industry history. The problems were already growing, but they were hidden underneath revenues that increased every quarter. 1980 marked the year when video games transformed from a niche hobby into mainstream American culture. The 2600 appeared in over 8 million homes, which meant roughly 1 in 10 American households owned an Atari console, The games themselves had evolved from the simple abstract designs of Pong and Combat into more sophisticated experiences. Adventure featured multiple rooms, inventory management, and an actual game world to explore. Space Invaders, licensed from the Japanese arcade game, became the first killer app that drove console purchases. Consumers bought 2,600 units specifically to play Space Invaders at home. Missile Command and Asteroids followed, each selling over 1 million cartridges. The retail price for games had stabilized around $30 per cartridge, which seemed expensive compared to board games or toys, but reasonable compared to taking a family to a movie or arcade. The mathematics of the business were staggering. If Atari sold 2 million copies of a game that cost $10 to manufacture and retailed for $30 wholesale to retailers, they generated $40 million in revenue and $30 million in gross profit from a single title. And they were releasing 10 to 15 new games per year. The manufacturing infrastructure required to support this scale was unprecedented in consumer electronics. The El Paso facility expanded to over 200,000 square feet, employing over 2,000 workers who operated injection molding machines, producing plastic cartridge shells, automated assembly lines inserting circuit boards into cases, and packaging systems that could box and label 10,000 units per hour. The Sunnyvale headquarters focused on engineering and design, with over 150 programmers, artists, and hardware engineers developing both new games and improved console hardware. Atari's purchasing department negotiated contracts with semiconductor manufacturers for millions of memory chips, with petroleum companies for the plastic resin used in cartridge shells, and with printing companies for instruction manuals and box artwork. The complexity of coordinating this supply chain meant that decisions about which games to produce had to be made 6 to 9 months before retail release, based on projections of future consumer demand that became increasingly speculative as the market grew. Warner Communications loved the numbers, but fundamentally misunderstood the business. To Warner's executives, trained in film and music distribution, Atari was a content company whose hardware happened to be the distribution mechanism. They pushed for more licensed properties, games based on movies, television shows, and other Warner-owned intellectual property, believing that brand recognition would guarantee sales the way a movie sequel or popular musician's new album generated predictable revenue. Atari's engineers and designers knew this logic was flawed. Video games sold based on gameplay quality, not character recognition. A great game with original characters would outsell a mediocre game featuring beloved characters every time. But Warner's influence grew as revenues increased, and the company's leadership shifted from people who understood games to executives whose primary metric was quarterly earnings growth. Ray Kasser, who became Atari's CEO in 1978, came from a background in textile manufacturing and brought a corporate management style that treated games as interchangeable products rather than creative works requiring care and iteration. The tension between creative vision and corporate efficiency manifested in how games were developed. In Atari's early years, designers had months to refine games, testing them in arcades or with focus groups, adjusting difficulty and mechanics until the experience felt right. As pressure increased to release more titles faster, development timelines compressed. Games that would have taken 9 months in 1978 were now expected in 6 months or less. Quality control consisted of checking for obvious bugs, not evaluating whether the game was actually fun to play. The result was an increasing percentage of mediocre releases that sold based on marketing and brand recognition rather than quality. Consumers bought them anyway because the 2600 had no competition. The Magnavox Odyssey, 2 and Mattel's Intellivision captured small market shares but couldn't match Atari's brand dominance or game library. For every disappointing purchase, there were enough good titles to maintain consumer confidence that Atari games were worth buying. This forgiveness window, where consumers continued purchasing despite declining average quality, would prove to be temporary. But in 1980 and 1981, it seemed permanent. The breakthrough moment that convinced Warner and Atari's leadership that licensed properties were the future came from an unlikely source: Space Invaders, a game Atari had licensed from the Japanese company Taito. The 2600 port sold over 2 million cartridges at $40 each, generating over $80 million in revenue from a single title. The lesson Warner took from this success was that licensed content drove sales. The actual lesson that Space Invaders succeeded because it was one of the most popular arcade games in history, and because Atari's programmers had spent 8 months optimizing the port to run well on the 2600's limited hardware, was ignored. What mattered to Warner's executives was that they had paid a licensing fee for someone else's intellectual property and generated massive profits. The strategic implications seemed obvious: find more licensed properties, pay the fees, and convert them into cartridge sales. This logic led directly to the two decisions that would destroy the company: the E.T. game and the Pac-Man port, both of which seemed like guaranteed successes based on the Space Invaders precedent. By the end of 1981, Atari had sold over 12,002,600 consoles and controlled over 75% of the home video game market. The company employed over 7,000 people and was generating over $1 billion in annual revenue, making it Warner Communications' most profitable division by a substantial margin. The stock market valued Warner based largely on Atari's performance, with analysts projecting continued growth that would reach $2 billion by 1983 and $5 billion by 1985. These projections assumed that the market for video games was essentially unlimited, that every American household would eventually own a console, and that each household would continue buying games indefinitely. No one seriously questioned whether consumer demand might plateau or whether flooding the market with low-quality games might eventually erode the trust that had made Atari synonymous with home entertainment. The warning signs were already visible. Returns of poor-quality third-party games were increasing. Consumer complaints about false advertising were rising, and retail buyers were becoming more selective about which titles they would stock. But these signals were drowned out by quarterly revenue reports that continued to exceed expectations. Pac-Man arrived in American arcades in October 1980 and became a cultural phenomenon that transcended gaming. By mid-1981, over 100,000 Pac-Man arcade machines were generating over $1 billion in quarters annually, making it the most successful coin-operated game in history. The character appeared on t-shirts, lunchboxes, board games, and eventually a Saturday morning cartoon show. Pac-Man wasn't just a game, it was a brand with mainstream recognition comparable to Mickey Mouse. For Warner Communications and Atari's leadership, this made Pac-Man the perfect property to license for the 2600. The logic seemed bulletproof. Pac-Man was the most popular arcade game in America. The 2600 was in over 12 million homes, and consumers had demonstrated willingness to pay $40 for home versions of their favorite arcade games. Even if only 20% of 2600 owners bought Pac-Man, that would be over 2 million sales, generating over $80 million in revenue. The licensing fee that Namco demanded, several million dollars plus royalties, seemed insignificant compared to the projected returns. The problem was that Pac-Man was technically impossible to recreate properly on the 2600 hardware. The arcade version featured smooth character animation, colorful graphics with multiple simultaneous sprites, and audio that included complex sound effects and the iconic Waka Waka eating sound. The 2600's processor and memory couldn't generate anything close to this experience. Its maximum sprite capability was 5 simultaneously displayed objects, while Pac-Man required at least 6, the player, 4 ghosts, and various dots and fruits. Creating a proper port would require reimagining the entire game engine, potentially reducing the maze size, simplifying Ghost AI, and compromising the visual presentation. Atari's engineers estimated this would take 9 to 12 months of development to do properly. Management gave them 5 weeks. The programmer assigned to the project, Todd Fry, did his best under impossible constraints. But the result was a game that bore only superficial resemblance to the arcade original. The maze flickered. The ghosts looked like deformed rectangles. The sound was a thin approximation of the arcade version, and the gameplay felt sluggish and imprecise. Atari manufactured 12 million Pac-Man cartridges, one for every 2,600 console in existence, assuming that every single owner would buy the game. This manufacturing decision reflected either extraordinary optimism or complete disconnection from market reality. To put that number in perspective, the most successful game Atari had released to date, Space Invaders, had sold 2 million cartridges over its entire lifetime. Atari was betting that Pac-Man would sell 6 times as many copies immediately. The company ramped up production at the El Paso facility, running 3 shifts and operating at maximum capacity for months to meet the projected demand. The cartridge manufacturing alone consumed millions of dollars in component costs, and Atari prepaid Namco's licensing royalties based on the projected sales figures. The entire operation was predicated on Pac-Man selling through completely at retail, generating hundreds of millions in revenue, and cementing Atari's position as the dominant force in home entertainment. The game launched in March 1982 with a massive marketing campaign featuring television commercials, print ads, and in-store displays that positioned it as the must-have title of the year. Initial sales seemed to validate the projections. Pac-Man sold over 7 million cartridges in the first few months, making it the fastest-selling video game in history and generating over $200 million in revenue. Warner's stock price jumped 15%. Internal projections suggested they would sell through the entire 12 million unit production run by Christmas. But then something unexpected happened. The sales stopped. Returns began flooding back to retailers. Consumer complaints about the game's quality compared to the arcade version became impossible to ignore. Game magazines, which had been generally favorable to Atari products, published scathing reviews calling the Pac-Man port a betrayal of the franchise and evidence that Atari cared more about marketing than quality. The 7 million sales figure, impressive in isolation, meant that 5 million cartridges remained unsold. 5 million units sitting in warehouses representing over $50 million in manufacturing costs and inventory that suddenly had no buyers. What Atari's leadership failed to understand was that those 7 million sales represented both success and failure simultaneously. The game had sold to the hardcore fans who would buy anything with the Pac-Man name, but it had alienated the broader audience who expected quality comparable to the arcade experience. More damaging, it had broken the implicit trust between Atari and consumers. For 5 years, buying an Atari game had generally meant getting a good product, even if it wasn't perfect. Pac-Man taught consumers that Atari would ship mediocre games if they thought the brand name alone would generate sales. This lesson would fundamentally change how people approached future Atari releases, introducing skepticism where there had been automatic purchase intent. But in mid-1982, this erosion of trust was still subtle enough to ignore. Revenue for the quarter was strong. Pac-Man had technically been a financial success despite the unsold inventory, and the Christmas season was approaching with several major releases scheduled. The leadership convinced themselves that Pac-Man's problems were an anomaly, not a symptom of deeper issues with how Atari developed and marketed games. The third-party publishers presented a different kind of threat that Atari consistently underestimated. Activision, founded by former Atari programmers, released games that were often better than Atari's own titles, and they did so without paying Atari any licensing fees or adhering to any quality standards. Their success spawned imitators: Imagic, Coleco, Parker Brothers, and, eventually, over 30 companies, all producing games for the 2600. Some of these companies made excellent products that legitimately expanded the platform's library. Many others produced garbage, games thrown together in weeks, packaged with misleading artwork, and sold based purely on hype. Retailers, hungry for product during the video game boom, stocked everything. Consumers, unable to distinguish quality from trash before purchase, bought based on box art and marketing. The result was an accelerating degradation of the average quality of 2,600 games available at retail, which Atari was powerless to stop because they had lost the legal battle to control their own platform. The correct response would have been creating a licensing system that allowed third-party development while maintaining quality standards and generating revenue for Atari. Instead, the company doubled down on its own releases, attempting to outpublish the third-party flood through sheer volume. By the fall of 1982, there were over 400 different games available for the 2,600 from various publishers. Retail stores didn't have shelf space to display even a fraction of this library, which meant that games competed for limited visibility in stores where buyers were overwhelmed by choices. The average consumer looking at a wall of cartridges had no reliable way to determine which were worth buying. Reviews were scattered across niche magazines, word of mouth took weeks to spread, and return policies varied by retailer. The natural response was to stick with known brands and licensed properties. Buy the game featuring a character you recognize, or buy the Atari-branded title because the company made the console. This dynamic meant that licenses and brand recognition became more valuable than quality, creating perverse incentives that would reach their apex with E.T. the Extraterrestrial. In the moment, however, Atari's leadership saw the expanding third-party market as validation of the 2600's success rather than a threat to its ecosystem. More games meant more reasons to own a console, which meant more hardware sales, which meant more potential buyers for Atari's own titles. The logic was sound until it wasn't. Steven Spielberg's E.T. The Extraterrestrial premiered in June 1982 and became the highest-grossing film of all time within 3 months, generating over $400 million at the box office and creating a merchandising empire that included toys, clothing, and every conceivable licensed product. Warner Communications held the video game rights through Atari, and CEO Ray Kassar saw an opportunity that seemed too perfect to pass up. Release an E.T. video game for the 2600 in time for Christmas 1982. When the film would still be in theaters and E.T. merchandise would be the most sought-after items on every child's wish list. The licensing deal with Universal Pictures and Spielberg's production company cost Atari over $25 million, the largest sum ever paid for video game rights, but the projected returns justified the expense. Atari planned to manufacture 5 million cartridges at roughly $15 each, including licensing fees, and sell them at retail for $40, generating over $200 million in revenue if they sold through completely. Even a 50% sell-through would recover costs and generate profits. The fatal decision was timing. Kassar wanted the game on shelves by the first week of December to capture the full Christmas shopping season. This meant the entire development process, design, programming, testing, manufacturing, and distribution, had to be completed in 5 months, from July to November. A typical Atari game took 6 to 9 months to develop properly. A complex game based on a movie property, which would require creating original gameplay mechanics while capturing the film's tone and narrative, would normally take over a year. 5 months was impossible, but Kassar wouldn't adjust the deadline. He assigned the project to Howard Scott Warshaw, one of Atari's most talented designers, who had created Raiders of the Lost Ark and Yar's Revenge, both critically acclaimed titles. Warshaw met with Spielberg, who suggested the game should capture the emotional heart of the film, the friendship between a lonely boy and an alien trying to return home. This was terrible direction for a video game because emotions don't translate into gameplay mechanics, but Warshaw had no time to iterate on alternative concepts. Warshaw spent 5 weeks designing and programming the entire game, working 18-hour days in a race against manufacturing deadlines that were set before he had written a single line of code. The game he created featured E.T. wandering through a series of pits, collecting phone pieces to call home, while avoiding government agents and scientists. The mechanics were confusing, the controls were imprecise, and the gameplay consisted primarily of falling into pits and using a levitation power to escape, then falling into another pit. There was no clear objective presented to the player, no tutorial explaining what the various items did, and no difficulty curve. The game started at maximum frustration and stayed there. Warshaw knew the game wasn't good, but he also knew he had no more time. The manufacturing deadline was absolute. Miss it. And Atari would have no E.T. game for Christmas, which would be a catastrophic failure given the licensing investment and marketing commitments. He delivered the code, and Atari immediately began production of 5 million cartridges without conducting any meaningful consumer testing or focus group research. The manufacturing decision to produce 5 million units reveals how detached Atari's leadership had become from market realities. 5 million was more units than any game in history had sold in its first year except Pac-Man, and Pac-Man had been a disaster relative to projections. The 2,600 install base in late 1982 was approximately 15 million consoles, which meant Atari was betting that 1 in 3 console owners would buy E.T. For context, a successful game typically sold to 5 to 10% of the install base. Exceptional games might reach 15%. 33% would require the game to be not just good, but one of the defining titles of the platform, comparable to Space Invaders or Adventure. Instead, they had shipped a barely functional product developed in 5 weeks. The decision becomes even more inexplicable when you consider that Atari had concrete evidence from Pac-Man that overproduction created catastrophic inventory problems. They had learned nothing from that experience. Or, more accurately, they had learned the wrong lesson. Pac-Man's initial sales figures suggested that massive production runs could work. So they applied the same logic to E.T., ignoring the fact that Pac-Man's unsold inventory was still sitting in warehouses. The game released in early December with a marketing blitz that positioned it as the must-have gift of the holiday season. Television commercials aired during prime time. Print ads appeared in every major magazine and newspaper. Retail stores set up elaborate E.T.-themed displays. The initial sales were strong, over 1 million cartridges sold in the first few weeks, generating $40 million in revenue. And then the returns started. Unlike Pac-Man, where consumers were disappointed but kept the game, E.T. was so poorly designed that parents returned it in unprecedented numbers, demanding refunds or exchanges. Retailers who had stocked E.T. Heavily based on Atari's projections and marketing support, found themselves with tens of thousands of returned cartridges and angry customers. By January 1983, stores were refusing to accept new Atari shipments and demanding that the company take back unsold inventory. The El Paso manufacturing facility, which had produced cartridges around the clock to meet demand, shut down production lines, and began processing returns instead. The financial impact was catastrophic. Atari had spent over $100 million on ET development, licensing, manufacturing, and marketing. They had sold roughly 1.5 million cartridges before returns, and refusal of shipments stopped sales completely. This meant 3.5 million cartridges, representing over $50 million in manufacturing costs alone, were either sitting in warehouses or being returned by retailers. The licensing fee paid to Universal was non-refundable, so that $25 million was simply lost. The manufacturing costs were sunk. The marketing expenses generated awareness of a bad product, which was arguably worse than no awareness at all. When you account for the cost of processing returns, dealing with retailer disputes, and the destruction of consumer confidence in Atari as a brand, ET lost somewhere between $100 and $150 million. But the financial loss, devastating as it was, paled compared to the strategic damage. ET proved that Atari would ship anything if they thought the license would sell it. Consumers who had been burned by Pac-Man and then burned again by ET stopped buying Atari games on faith. The automatic purchase intent that had made Atari dominant was gone, replaced by suspicion and skepticism that no amount of marketing could overcome. The first quarter of 1983 should have been a victory lap. The 2600 had sold over 20 million units lifetime, making it the most successful video game console in history. Atari had released several genuinely good games in late 1982 and early 1983, including Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back, and the arcade port of Joust, both of which received positive reviews and solid sales. The arcade division was thriving, with new releases generating millions in quarters. Warner Communications announced projections for continued growth, with analysts expecting Atari to reach $2 billion in annual revenue by year-end. The infrastructure was in place, manufacturing facilities running at capacity, a sales force that had relationships with every major retailer in America, and engineering teams developing next-generation hardware. From a purely operational perspective, Atari was executing everything correctly. The problem was that consumers had stopped trusting the company, and once trust evaporates in a consumer business, no amount of operational efficiency can recover it. Retailers began the revolt in February 1983 by refusing new shipments and demanding more flexible return policies. The standard arrangement had been that retailers purchased inventory from Atari at wholesale prices, took ownership of the products, and accepted the risk that unsold games would sit on shelves. This model worked when games sold through reliably, but the Pac-Man and ET disasters had created a different dynamic. Stores had invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in Atari inventory that wasn't moving. The new games might be good, but consumers weren't buying them because the last two major releases had been disasters. Retailers demanded that Atari take back unsold inventory from 1982, offer deeper discounts on new releases, and provide guaranteed return policies that shifted inventory risk back to the manufacturer. Atari's management initially refused, arguing that retail agreements were binding and that stores had profited enormously from Atari products for years. The retailers responded by reducing Atari's shelf space, giving priority to competitors like Intellivision and ColecoVision, and refusing to commit to orders for Atari's upcoming releases. This standoff created a catastrophic situation. Atari's manufacturing facilities were producing cartridges for a distribution channel that was actively hostile to receiving them. The third-party publishers, facing the same retail resistance, responded by flooding the market with desperate attempts to generate sales through price cuts and aggressive licensing deals. Parker Brothers released a version of Star Wars for the 2600 that competed directly with Atari's official release. Coleco created a Donkey Kong port that outsold Atari's titles despite questionable quality. Activision, still producing the best third-party games, couldn't overcome the general market saturation. Even excellent titles were lost in the noise of hundreds of mediocre releases. The financial model that had sustained third-party publishing, low development costs, high margins, minimal marketing, collapsed when retailers stopped automatically stocking everything. Companies that had been profitable in 1982 were losing money in early 1983, and many began liquidating inventory at prices below manufacturing cost just to generate cash flow. This created a race to the bottom, where games that had retailed for $30 to $40 in 1982 were available for $10 to $15 by spring 1983, which made it impossible for new releases to command premium pricing. Warner Communications reported in April 1983 that Atari had lost over $300 million in the first quarter, transforming from the company's most profitable division to its biggest liability in less than 6 months. The stock price collapsed, dropping nearly 50% in a single week. Analysts who had been bullish on Atari throughout 1982 reversed their positions, issuing sell recommendations and warning that the video game market had been a fad that was now contracting to more sustainable levels. Warner's CEO Steve Ross, who had championed the Atari acquisition and defended its management through multiple controversies, announced that Ray Kasser would be replaced as CEO. The search for a replacement would take months, during which Atari operated without clear strategic direction, continuing to manufacture products for a market that was actively rejecting them. The manufacturing facilities in El Paso and Sunnyvale continued production through May based on forecasts created in late 1982, producing millions of cartridges that would never be sold at anything close to profitable prices. The human cost manifested in layoffs that began in June 1983 and continued throughout the year. Atari employed over 10,000 people at its peak, including engineers, manufacturing workers, salespeople, and corporate staff. By the end of 1983, fewer than 3,000 remained. The El Paso facility, which had operated 3 shifts producing cartridges around the clock, shut down entirely by August. The Sunnyvale headquarters saw wave after wave of cuts as entire departments were eliminated. The engineering teams that had created the arcade hits and developed games for the 2600 were reduced to a skeleton crew maintaining existing products. The company that had been a symbol of Silicon Valley innovation and the future of entertainment became just another corporate restructuring story, with former employees scattered across the industry telling cautionary tales about what happens when a company prioritizes short-term growth over sustainable quality. The strategic question facing Warner was whether to invest in stabilizing Atari or cut losses and exit the video game business entirely. The case for continued investment was that Atari still controlled significant market share, had recognizable brand value, and possessed technical infrastructure that would be expensive to rebuild from scratch. The case for exit was that the video game market appeared to be collapsing industry-wide, that Atari's brand had been so damaged by Pac-Man and E.T. that recovery might be impossible, and that continued losses could threaten Warner's other divisions. The decision was complicated by the fact that several potential buyers had expressed interest in acquiring Atari's assets, but at valuations that were a fraction of what Warner had invested. Selling would mean admitting a catastrophic strategic failure and accepting massive write-downs. Holding on meant potentially throwing more money into a dying business. Warner chose a middle path that satisfied no one. They would keep Atari but slash investment, discontinue unprofitable product lines, and focus on the next-generation console that was already in development. This decision extended Atari's decline rather than resolving it, creating a zombie company that continued operating without the resources needed to compete effectively. The Alamogordo landfill burial happened because Atari had a problem that couldn't be solved through normal channels. Millions of unsold cartridges sitting in warehouses, generating storage costs and representing inventory that would never be sold. The standard approach would be liquidating through discount retailers or international markets, but there wasn't enough demand even at fire sale prices to move the volume involved. Destroying the cartridges through normal waste disposal would have been expensive and potentially complicated by the fact that the cartridges contained small amounts of copper and other metals that required special handling. The landfill option was cheap, permanent, and located in a remote area where the burial would attract minimal attention. In September 1983, Atari contracted with a waste disposal company to transport truckloads of cartridges from warehouses in Texas to the Alamogordo Municipal Landfill in New Mexico. The inventory buried wasn't just ET cartridges, though those constituted the majority. The trucks also carried unsold copies of Pac-Man, Raiders of the Lost Ark, and various other titles that had failed to sell through retail channels. The disposal company dumped the cartridges into a designated pit approximately 30 feet deep, using bulldozers to break apart the boxes and flatten the plastic cases, then covered everything with layers of concrete and dirt. The burial was supposed to be discreet, but rumors spread immediately. Local newspapers reported trucks arriving at night, game cartridges visible in the landfill, and concrete being poured to seal the pit. Gaming magazines picked up the story, treating it as evidence of Atari's collapse and the end of the video game industry. The company refused to confirm or deny details, which only intensified speculation about how many cartridges were buried and whether the disposal represented a tax write-off strategy or simply the cheapest way to eliminate embarrassing evidence of overproduction. What made the landfill burial symbolically significant was that it represented the physical manifestation of strategic failure. These weren't defective products being recalled or obsolete inventory being retired. They were brand new games that Atari had spent millions manufacturing based on projections that turned out to be catastrophically wrong. The ET cartridges in particular embodied the entire arc of Atari's collapse. Enormous licensing fee paid for a valuable property, impossible development deadlines set by executives who didn't understand game development, massive overproduction based on faith in brand recognition over quality, and complete failure in the market because consumers wouldn't buy garbage even if it featured beloved characters. Burying them in concrete wasn't just waste disposal. It was an admission that the entire strategic framework that had guided Atari's decision-making had been fundamentally wrong. The imagery of video games buried in a landfill would become the defining metaphor for what journalists and historians would call the Great Video Game Crash of 1983. The financial consequences for Warner Communications extended beyond Atari's operating losses. The company took a write-down of over $500 million in 1983 related to Atari's unsold inventory, canceled contracts, and diminished asset values. Warner's stock price fell by over 60% from its peak, wiping out billions in shareholder value. Steve Ross faced pressure from board members and investors to explain how a division that had generated over $1 billion in revenue 18 months earlier had become a liability requiring hundreds of millions in write-downs. The answer, which Ross eventually articulated in Warner's annual report, was that Atari's management had mistaken a rapidly growing market for an unlimited market, had prioritized short-term revenue, maximization over sustainable quality, and had failed to maintain the brand trust that was the foundation of consumer purchasing decisions. This analysis was accurate but incomplete. It didn't address Warner's own role in pushing for licensing deals and aggressive growth targets that had directly contributed to the decisions that destroyed the company. The industry-wide impact of Atari's collapse rippled through every company involved in video games. Third-party publishers that had been profitable in 1982 went bankrupt throughout 1983 and 1984. Imagic, which had raised $40 million in venture capital and planned a public offering, shut down completely. Coleco and Mattel, which had competed with Atari through their own console systems, abandoned the video game market entirely, returning to their core businesses of toys and electronics. Retailers liquidated video game inventory at 70 to 80% discounts, taking massive losses and determining that games weren't worth the shelf space compared to more reliable product categories. Toy stores removed gaming sections entirely. Electronic specialty stores closed by the dozens. The arcade business, while never as profitable as home consoles during Atari's peak, saw quarter revenues drop by 30 to 40% as the general public association between arcades and failing video game companies damaged the entire coin-op industry. The question of whether Atari could have been saved became a subject of endless speculation among industry observers, former employees, and business analysts. The optimistic view argued that the core technology and market demand still existed. People wanted to play video games, and the 2600 remained a viable platform with tens of millions of units in homes. If Atari had admitted the problems earlier, instituted quality controls, created a proper third-party licensing system, and rebuilt consumer trust through consistent delivery of good products, the brand could have recovered. The pessimistic view countered that once trust was broken at the scale Atari had achieved, no recovery was possible. Consumers who felt betrayed by Pac-Man and E.T. wouldn't give the company another chance regardless of how good future releases were. The market needed to reset completely, which meant Atari's dominance had to end before a new generation of companies could establish credibility. Both perspectives contained truth, but neither fully explained why Atari made the specific decisions that led to the collapse. Understanding that requires looking at the incentive structures and cultural assumptions that shaped how Warner and Atari's leadership interpreted the market signals they were receiving. The executive compensation structure at Atari aligned management incentives with short-term revenue growth rather than long-term brand health. Ray Kasser and other senior executives received bonuses based on quarterly revenues and year-over-year growth percentages, which meant that decisions maximizing immediate sales were rewarded regardless of their impact on future performance. This created a dynamic where licensing expensive properties like Pac-Man and E.T. made perfect sense financially for executives, even if the games themselves were compromised by rushed development or technical limitations. The licensing fee for E.T., while enormous in absolute terms, represented a small percentage of projected revenues if the game sold through completely. The executive making that decision was betting with company money, but would personally capture a share of the upside through bonuses while facing limited personal downside if the bet failed. This asymmetry between personal reward and institutional risk explains many of the decisions that seem inexplicable from an outside perspective. The manufacturing and inventory policies were driven by Wall Street's obsession with growth rates and revenue projections. Analysts valued companies based on expected future earnings, which meant that companies reporting higher growth rates commanded higher stock valuations. Atari's explosive growth from 1978 to 1981 had made it a Wall Street darling, with projections that assumed growth would continue indefinitely because video games represented a new category of home entertainment with essentially unlimited addressable market. These projections influenced how Warner allocated capital and how Atari planned production. If analysts expected 25% year-over-year growth, then Atari needed to manufacture inventory sufficient to hit those numbers, which meant constantly increasing production volumes regardless of actual retail sell-through data. The manufacturing decisions that created millions in unsold inventory weren't made in ignorance of market conditions. They were made in service of maintaining growth trajectories that justified Warner's stock price. The relationship between Warner Communications and Atari created a principal-agent problem where the parent company's interests diverged from the subsidiary's long-term health. Warner executives cared about Atari primarily as a profit center contributing to corporate earnings. They had limited understanding of video game development, minimal connection to gaming culture, and no personal investment in whether specific games were good or bad beyond their impact on quarterly reports. This meant Warner pushed for decisions that maximized near-term financial performance, even when those decisions compromised Atari's market position. The ET Christmas deadline was imposed by Warner executives, who cared about revenue recognition in fiscal year 1982 and didn't particularly care whether the game was good enough to sustain consumer confidence in future releases. From Warner's perspective, they owned a content distribution business, and the specific quality of individual content items mattered less than maintaining overall volume and hitting revenue targets. The engineering culture at Atari evolved from a small creative team where programmers had autonomy and took pride in their work into a corporate environment where games were products manufactured to specifications on fixed timelines. Early Atari designers like Warren Robinette and David Crane treated games as artistic expressions that required iteration and refinement until the experience felt right. By 1982, the culture had shifted to treating games as content that filled cartridges according to production schedules. Programmers were assigned projects based on availability rather than passion or expertise. Development timelines were set by manufacturing requirements rather than creative needs. Quality control consisted of bug testing rather than evaluating whether games were actually fun to play. This transformation was inevitable at scale. You can't manufacture dozens of games per year while maintaining the artisanal approach that worked when you released 5 games annually. But it created a situation where the people making games had no ownership of outcomes and limited ability to push back against unrealistic demands. The competitive response to third-party publishers revealed Atari's fundamental confusion about what business they were actually in. When former employees founded Activision and began releasing games for the 2600, Atari's management viewed it as theft. These people were using Atari's platform to compete directly with Atari's products without permission or compensation. The legal response, attempting to prevent third-party development entirely, reflected a belief that Atari owned the entire video game ecosystem and that anyone creating games for the 2600 was violating Atari's property rights. This perspective was understandable from a hardware manufacturer's standpoint. Apple would maintain similar control over iOS for decades, but it was legally indefensible in 1980 and strategically counterproductive. The correct response would have been creating a licensing system that allowed third-party development, while maintaining quality standards and generating revenue for Atari. Instead, the company fought a battle they couldn't win, lost in court, and then faced an uncontrolled explosion of third-party releases that flooded the market with low-quality games that damaged the entire ecosystem. The marketing decisions reflected a broader confusion between brand strength and product quality. Atari's leadership believed the brand was strong enough to sell anything, which was true until it wasn't. The success of early releases like Space Invaders and Adventure created a situation where consumers bought Atari games reflexively, trusting that the brand guaranteed quality. This trust was an asset built over years of generally good products, but Atari's management treated it as an infinite resource rather than a depletable one. Every mediocre release consumed a portion of that trust, and once trust was exhausted, no amount of marketing could regenerate it. The Pac-Man and ET disasters happened because management assumed they could substitute brand recognition and licensed properties for quality gameplay. And by the time they realized this assumption was wrong, they had already manufactured millions of units and committed hundreds of millions of dollars to marketing campaigns that amplified the message that Atari didn't care about quality anymore. While Atari was collapsing, Nintendo was studying the American market from Japan and learning exactly what not to do. Nintendo had dominated the Japanese video game market through the Famicom console, released in 1983, but they watched the American crash with intense interest because they planned to enter the US market within 2 years. The lessons they derived from Atari's failure would shape how Nintendo structured the entire video game industry for the next 2 decades. First lesson: never let third-party publishers flood the market with garbage. Nintendo would implement a strict licensing system where every game required approval. Publishers paid licensing fees, and Nintendo controlled manufacturing of cartridges. This prevented the market saturation that had killed the 2600 ecosystem. Second lesson: brand trust is everything, and it must be defended aggressively. Nintendo's Seal of Quality program, where approved games carried a gold stamp certifying Nintendo's approval, was specifically designed to signal to consumers that not all games were created equal, and that Nintendo stood behind products bearing their name. The strategic implications of Atari's collapse extended beyond video games into broader lessons about platform businesses. Atari had created a platform, the 2600 console, and then failed to properly govern that platform, allowing it to be exploited by low-quality content that destroyed consumer confidence in the entire ecosystem. This failure became a case study in how platform owners need to balance openness with control, how quality curation creates more value than unrestricted access, and how short-term revenue maximization can destroy long-term platform viability. These lessons would influence platform governance across technology industries. Apple's App Store approval process, Google's Android certification program, and Microsoft's Xbox game licensing all reflected insights derived from studying what went wrong at Atari. The idea that a platform owner has responsibility for quality control wasn't obvious before Atari's collapse. Afterward, it became industry gospel. The timing of Atari's implosion created a window of opportunity for competitors that might not have existed otherwise. ColecoVision had launched in 1982 with superior hardware to the 2600 and gained modest market share. But the overall video game crash destroyed the company before they could capitalize on Atari's weakness. Mattel's Intellivision faced similar problems, exiting the market in 1984 after losing hundreds of millions. The market didn't just reject Atari, it rejected video games entirely as a legitimate entertainment category. This meant that when Nintendo launched the NES in the United States in 1985, they couldn't position it as a video game console because that category was considered dead. Instead, they marketed it as an entertainment system, emphasized the robotic accessory to make it seem like a sophisticated toy rather than another doomed game machine, and focused marketing on children rather than the broader family demographic that Atari had targeted. The strategy worked because Nintendo understood that Atari hadn't failed due to bad luck or market timing. They had failed due to specific, identifiable decisions that could be avoided by a company willing to prioritize long-term platform health over short-term revenue maximization. The technological legacy of Atari persisted even as the company collapsed. The 2600's architecture influenced console design for decades, establishing patterns like cartridge-based game distribution, standardized controllers, and hardware designed around the television as the primary display. The engineering innovations developed at Atari, sprite graphics, hardware scrolling, custom processors optimized for game logic, became foundational technologies refined by subsequent generations. Many of the engineers who left Atari during the layoffs went on to found companies or work at firms that would define the next era of gaming. Some went to Nintendo, others to Sega. Several founded successful game development studios. The institutional knowledge of how to design games, optimize for hardware constraints, and create compelling gameplay experiences didn't disappear when Atari collapsed. It was distributed throughout the industry, seeding the next generation of innovation. The cultural impact was more ambiguous. Atari had popularized video games as mainstream entertainment, bringing interactive digital experiences into living rooms across America and establishing gaming as a legitimate hobby rather than a niche pursuit for enthusiasts. The collapse nearly reversed this progress. Video games became associated with failure, waste, and a fad that had passed. Arcades, which had flourished during Atari's peak years, suffered from guilt by association, even though arcade games remained technically superior and profitable compared to home consoles. The perception that video games were a failed experiment would persist for years, requiring Nintendo to essentially reintroduce the concept to American consumers who had decided the entire category was worthless. This meant that when gaming did recover in the late 1980s, it would be building from a reputation damaged by Atari's spectacular public failure, requiring years of sustained quality and market success to overcome the stigma of the crash. The most fundamental lesson from Atari's collapse is that platform businesses must govern their ecosystems, even when doing so sacrifices short-term revenue. Atari generated enormous profits by selling hardware at scale and allowing anyone to create software for that hardware without oversight or quality control. This maximized near-term revenues because every game sold by every publisher expanded the market and drove hardware sales. But it created a tragedy of the commons where individual publishers had incentives to maximize their own output, regardless of impact on the overall platform quality. No single publisher bore the cost of market saturation or declining consumer confidence. Those costs were distributed across the entire ecosystem. Atari, as the platform owner, should have recognized that they uniquely bore the long-term costs of ecosystem degradation and should have implemented governance structures to prevent it. Their failure to do so destroyed billions in shareholder value and set the video game industry back years. Companies that learned this lesson, Nintendo, Apple, Microsoft, Sony, built licensing systems, approval processes, and quality standards that restricted short-term revenues in favor of long-term platform health. The second lesson is that brand trust is built slowly and destroyed quickly, and once destroyed, it cannot be rebuilt through marketing alone. Atari spent 5 years building consumer confidence that buying an Atari product meant getting quality entertainment. That trust was based on consistent delivery of good games, reliable hardware, and a general sense that the company cared about customer experience. Pac-Man damaged that trust. E.T. destroyed it completely. No amount of advertising could recreate the automatic purchase intent that had made Atari dominant, because consumers had learned through direct experience that Atari would ship garbage if they thought the license would sell it. The only way to rebuild trust is through sustained delivery of quality products over time. But Atari never got the chance because the financial collapse happened too quickly. The broader lesson applies across industries. Companies that trade long-term brand equity for short-term revenue maximize quarterly reports at the expense of franchise value, and once that exchange is made, the path back is extraordinarily difficult and expensive. The third lesson concerns the danger of mistaking a growing market for an unlimited one. Video game sales grew exponentially from 1978 to 1982, increasing by 30 to 50% annually for 4 consecutive years. This created an environment where everyone involved, Atari's management, Warner's executives, Wall Street analysts, retailers, began to believe that growth was structural rather than transitional. They projected the growth rates forward indefinitely, building business plans that assumed every American household would own a console and buy dozens of games over the console's lifetime. These projections were used to justify enormous investments in manufacturing capacity, aggressive licensing fees, and inventory levels that assumed continued acceleration of demand. When growth slowed, as it inevitably would, the entire structure collapsed because it was built on assumptions of unlimited expansion. Companies that avoid this trap recognize that high growth rates are temporary phenomena that will eventually revert to more sustainable levels, and they build their operations and financial planning around conservative projections rather than extrapolations of temporary trends. The fourth lesson, specific to Atari but applicable more broadly, is that success breeds its own form of blindness. Atari dominated the home video game market so completely for so long that management lost the ability to imagine that dominance ending. The warning signs were everywhere: declining quality of games, increasing returns, retailer pushback, consumer complaints. But every quarter's revenue exceeded the previous quarters, which created a narrative that everything was fine and problems were temporary fluctuations. The leadership couldn't reconcile the negative signals with the positive revenue trajectory, so they dismissed the signals as noise rather than early warnings of structural problems. This cognitive bias, where success in the present prevents recognition of emerging threats, is perhaps the most dangerous aspect of market dominance. Companies at the top of their industries are surrounded by evidence of their success, which makes it psychologically difficult to accept evidence that the foundation of that success is eroding. The companies that survive long-term are those that maintain institutional paranoia, even during periods of success, treating every negative signal as potentially indicative of deeper problems that require immediate attention. The counter lesson, often overlooked in analyses of Atari's failure, is that some elements of their strategy were correct and remain valid. Building a platform that others could develop for was the right approach. It created more content than Atari could have produced internally and expanded the market in ways that benefited everyone. The cartridge-based distribution system that allowed software updates without hardware replacements was innovative and became industry standard. The focus on accessible gameplay rather than technical complexity proved correct. Nintendo's success came from games that were easy to learn and difficult to master, exactly the philosophy Bushnell had articulated in 1972. The insight that home entertainment systems could generate recurring revenue through software sales after the initial hardware purchase was foundational to the entire video game business model and has been replicated across digital platforms. Atari's failure wasn't in their strategic vision. It was in execution, governance, and the specific decisions made under pressure to hit growth targets that seemed achievable but required sacrificing quality. The Alamogordo landfill site sits quiet today, an unremarkable patch of desert in southern New Mexico marked by nothing except a historical placard installed in 2014 after excavation confirmed the burial rumors. That year, a documentary film crew received permission to dig, and they found what had been buried 31 years earlier. Thousands of crushed cartridges, including E.T., Pac-Man, and dozens of other titles, all encased in concrete and dirt, exactly as the reports had described. The excavation attracted media attention briefly, with gaming enthusiasts traveling to watch bulldozers unearth pieces of gaming history, and several cartridges were recovered and sold to collectors for hundreds of dollars each. The irony of games that couldn't be given away in 1983 becoming valuable memorabilia 3 decades later wasn't lost on anyone present. The landfill burial had transformed from shameful waste disposal into archaeological site, evidence of a corporate disaster so complete that it entered cultural mythology. Atari exists today as a brand name owned by a French company. Atari SA, which licenses the name and logo to various gaming ventures while bearing no institutional continuity with the original organization. The Sunnyvale headquarters is gone, replaced by generic office buildings occupied by tech startups that have no connection to video games. The El Paso manufacturing facility was demolished years ago. The arcade games that launched the company survive in museum collections and through emulation software, played by enthusiasts who appreciate the historical significance more than the gameplay itself. The 2600, which sold over 30 million units during its commercial life, remains a collectible item with functioning consoles trading hands through vintage gaming communities. The games themselves, freed from contemporary expectations and judged as historical artifacts, look better in retrospect than they did in 1983. Primitive but charming. Limited by technology but creative within those constraints. The employees who built Atari dispersed throughout the technology industry, just carrying lessons and stories that would influence companies for decades. Howard Scott Warshaw, the programmer assigned the impossible ET deadline, left the gaming industry entirely, eventually becoming a licensed psychotherapist in California. Warren Robinette, creator of Adventure and the first Easter egg, continued in game design before moving to academic research in virtual reality. Nolan Bushnell founded multiple companies after leaving Atari, some successful and others failures, but none approaching the cultural impact of his first venture. The engineers, artists, and designers who created the 2600's game library moved to Nintendo, Sega, Electronic Arts, and countless smaller studios, building the industry that would emerge from Atari's ruins. The institutional knowledge didn't die. It was distributed, refined, and applied to building companies that would avoid the mistakes that had destroyed their former employer. The broader question of whether Atari's collapse was inevitable or preventable remains contested among business historians and game industry analysts. The perspective that it was inevitable argues that the video game market of 1982 was unsustainable regardless of Atari's specific decisions. Too many publishers, too many bad games, too much capital chasing growth that couldn't continue. The collapse would have happened eventually even if Atari had made better choices. They simply accelerated it through particularly bad execution. The alternative view contends that Atari's specific failures created the crash. If they had maintained quality standards, implemented proper licensing systems, and avoided catastrophic releases like ET, the market could have continued growing more sustainably. Other companies would have failed, but Atari could have survived as a dominant platform. Both perspectives contain elements of truth, but what's inarguable is that Atari's decisions made the crash worse, faster, and more complete than it needed to be. What the landfill burial represents, beyond the literal disposal of unsold inventory, is the physical manifestation of what happens when a company confuses market position with invincibility. Those cartridges sealed in concrete were manufactured by a company that believed their brand was strong enough to sell anything, that consumers would buy whatever carried the Atari name regardless of quality. And that market dominance was permanent rather than provisional. The concrete poured over them represented not just waste disposal, but the sealing away of evidence that these assumptions had been catastrophically wrong. Video games didn't die in that landfill. Atari's hubris did, along with the specific arrogance that comes from succeeding so completely that you forget success, requires continued effort and care. The tombstone for Atari's empire, if such a thing exists, isn't located in Alamogordo, but in the memory of everyone who bought ET, expecting the magic of the film and received broken gameplay instead. It's in the collections of 2,600 cartridges gathering dust in storage units across America. Physical evidence of a time when video games meant Atari and Atari meant video games, before the company proved that dominance is temporary and trust, once broken, is irreplaceable. The lesson isn't adapt or die, though that's often how the story is simplified. The lesson is that success creates specific forms of blindness, that markets forgive many things but not contempt for customers, and that the same ambition that builds empires can destroy them if it loses connection to the fundamental reality that people buy products because they're good, not because companies are powerful. The concrete in that New Mexico landfill sealed away millions of cartridges, but it couldn't seal away the truth. Atari didn't fall because their technology became obsolete or because a competitor built something better. They fell because they forgot what made them great in the first place. That games should be fun, that consumers deserve respect, and that brand trust is a depletable resource that requires constant investment to maintain. Those lessons remain as relevant today as they were in 1983, buried under 30 feet of New Mexico dirt alongside the evidence of what happens when companies forget them.